Marcus Hale thought she'd fold. They always folded. He pressed the Glock against Zara's temple until the front sight broke skin, a thin line of blood threading down past her ear and dripping onto the collar of that deep red uniform she always wore. Her breath came out in short white clouds. The loading dock door was still open behind him, January pouring through it, like the building had been gutted. He liked that. He liked that she was shaking. "You think you can just cut me off?" Marcus's voice bounced off stainless steel. The kitchen of the Jade Lantern was all hard surfaces, industrial counters, magnetic strips loaded with chef's knives, a flat-top grill still ticking as it cooled. Every sound he made came back to him sharper. "You think you get to decide when this is over?" Zara didn't answer. Her hands were flat on the prep counter behind her, fingers spread, pressing into cold steel like she could push herself through it and out the other side. Tears ran down her face, but she hadn't made a sound. Not one. That bothered Marcus more than screaming would have. Screaming meant she still believed someone was coming. Silence meant she'd already accepted what he was. Marcus leaned in closer. He could smell the kitchen on her, sesame oil, gochujang, the sharp sweetness of julienned scallions, layered under the cocoa butter she rubbed into her hands every night after her shift. He'd memorized that smell across 2 years. Owned it. "The hard drive, Zara. The security footage. You're gonna hand it to me, and then you're gonna forget every single thing you saw on that tape. Nod if you understand." She didn't nod. His finger tightened on the trigger guard. Not the trigger. Not yet. But close enough that his hand was making a decision his brain hadn't fully committed to. The snow outside the loading dock was coming down heavier now, accumulating on the rubber floor mats just inside the threshold. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that flat, shadowless white that made the kitchen feel like an operating room. Or a morgue. Marcus was certain of 3 things. No one else was in the building. No one knew he was here. And Zara Hayes had exactly as long to live as it took for his patience to run out. He was wrong about all 3. If this story already has your heart pounding, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. I've got another story dropping tomorrow that's going to keep you up at night. And while you're here, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing this community stretch across the globe. All right, let's get back into it. 6 hours earlier, the Jade Lantern had been alive. The dinner rush at the upscale Korean fusion spot in Chicago's Wicker Park neighborhood ran from 6 to 10 on weeknights, and Zara Hayes had worked every minute of it, weaving between tables, with plates balanced on her forearms, refilling banchan dishes, smiling at customers who tipped well and smiling harder at the ones who didn't. Her braids were pulled back in a tight bun, the way the job required, and her dark brown skin caught the amber light from the pendant lamps above each booth. She moved like someone who had learned to make herself useful before anyone could decide she was disposable. By 11, the dining room was empty. By 11:30, the front-of-house staff had clocked out. By midnight, Zara was the only person left, wiping down the stainless steel prep stations, wrapping leftover kimchi jjigae in plastic, running the last load through the industrial dishwasher. She liked closing alone. The kitchen after hours belonged to her in a way nothing else in her life did. The quiet, the order, everything in its place. She didn't hear the loading dock door open. She didn't hear the boots on wet concrete. She heard the click, that small mechanical sound that exists in a category of its own, the sound of a round being chambered, a sound the body recognizes before the brain does. Every muscle in Zara's back locked. The sponge in her hand stopped moving. The water kept running. "Don't turn around." Marcus's voice. Of course it was Marcus's voice. She'd spent 2 years memorizing its registers, the playful low hum when he wanted something, the clipped flatness when he was about to punish her for an imagined betrayal. And this one, the wet, ragged edge of a man who had stopped pretending to be anything other than what he was. "Turn off the water. Step back. Hands where I can see them." Zara turned off the water. She stepped back. She raised her hands. She could see him now in the reflection on the polished steel hood above the grill. Distorted, stretched, but unmistakable. Marcus Hale, 6'1", 210 pounds of coiled aggression in a black hoodie and unlaced Timberlands. His left hand hung at his side. His right held the Glock, aimed at the back of her skull. His eyes were bloodshot, pupils blown wide. Not drugs this time, just the pure, uncut high of total power over another person. Snow dusted his shoulders. He'd come through the loading dock, which meant he'd been watching the building, waiting for the others to leave, waiting for her to be alone. 3 weeks. It had been 3 weeks since Zara found the footage on the restaurant's security system. Marcus in the back storage room, exchanging a duffel bag with a man she didn't recognize, the kind of transaction that didn't need a receipt. 3 weeks since she'd told Marcus it was over, truly over this time, and that if he came near the Jade Lantern again, that footage would find its way to people who'd care. She thought she'd been smart. She thought leverage meant safety. She hadn't understood that a man like Marcus didn't respond to threats by retreating. He responded by eliminating the person who made them. "Turn around," Marcus said. Slowly. Zara turned. She saw the gun first. Matte black, utilitarian, held steady despite the tremor she could see running through his forearm. Then his face. Sweat beading at his hairline despite the cold flooding through the open dock door. Jaw clenched so tight, the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. And his eyes. She'd seen those eyes soft once, seen them look at her, like she was the only warm thing in a cold city. That felt like a different lifetime, a different man. The man in front of her now had already decided how this ended. He walked her backward until her spine hit the prep counter. He raised the gun to her temple. The muzzle was warm from his grip, then cold from the air, then just pressure. Constant, precise. The geometry of violence reduced to a single point against her skin. The hard drive. Now. Outside, snow fell over the loading dock in silence. The alley behind the Jade Lantern was empty. Dumpsters, a recycling cage, the restaurant's service entrance with its rusted security light casting a weak orange cone onto the pavement. Nothing moved. The neighborhood was asleep. Marcus had chosen his moment perfectly. What he hadn't chosen, what he couldn't have known to choose, was the night. Because on most nights, the Jade Lantern's owner was miles away in a high-rise overlooking the lakefront, reviewing shipping manifests and profit margins that had nothing to do with bibimbap. On most nights, the restaurant ran itself, a well-oiled legitimate business in a portfolio of legitimate businesses that existed, in part, to make the illegitimate ones invisible. But tonight was not most nights. Tonight, Zhong Yejun, known in certain circles as the Smiling Tiger, head of the Zhong Syndicate, architect of an import empire that stretched from Busan to Chicago, had returned to the Jade Lantern for a midnight meeting with his lieutenant that had been moved up by 2 hours. He'd parked in the front, entered through the main dining room, and was removing his black overcoat when he heard the shouting from the kitchen. A man's voice, loud, unhinged, and beneath it, silence. The specific, practiced silence of someone who had learned that speaking only made it worse. Yejun folded his overcoat over the back of a dining chair. He straightened his narrow black tie. He walked toward the kitchen with the unhurried gait of a man who has never once needed to rush, because rushing implied uncertainty, and Zhong Yejun had not been uncertain about anything since he was 23 years old. He reached the kitchen door, pushed it open 2 inches, enough to see. A man, mid-20s, streetwear, desperate energy, holding a gun to the head of his waitress. Zara, the one who worked doubles without complaint, the one who remembered returning customers' names, the one his restaurant manager had described as the only person on staff who actually gives a damn. She was pressed against the counter with blood running from her temple, shaking, alive. The man with the gun was talking, demanding something, a hard drive, footage, making threats about what would happen if she didn't comply. Threats delivered with the confidence of someone who believed he was the most dangerous person in the room. Yejun's expression didn't change. The slight, polite smile he wore like a silk mask, the one that had been there through boardroom negotiations and back-alley executions alike, remained exactly in place. But behind it, something recalibrated. This was not a disruption. This was not an inconvenience. This was a man with a gun, in his restaurant, threatening his employee on his territory. And Yejun had not built what he'd built by allowing such things to go unanswered. He pushed the kitchen door open fully, stepped into the fluorescent light. Snow still dusted the shoulders of his dark suit from the walk between his car and the front entrance. His hands rested at his sides, empty, open, unthreatening. His shoes made no sound on the tile. Zara saw him first. Her eyes shifted, just barely, just for a half second, past Marcus's shoulder to the figure now standing 10 feet behind him. Tall, lean, sharp-featured, wearing a smile that didn't belong in a room with a gun. She didn't say a word, didn't react. 2 years of Marcus had taught her that much. Never signal, never warn, never give the man hurting you any information he hasn't already taken. Marcus kept talking, kept the gun pressed to her temple, kept believing he was in control. Behind him, Jung Yejun stood perfectly still in the cold light, patient as a blade, and waited for the right moment to speak. The kitchen hummed. The grill ticked as it cooled. Snow drifted through the open dock door, settling on the floor in a thin white line that crept closer to Marcus's boots. And Zara Hayes, 26 years old, blood on her face, a gun to her head, her heartbeat the loudest sound in the room, realized something that sent ice through her chest, colder than anything the Chicago winter could offer. The most dangerous man in this kitchen wasn't the one holding the weapon. It was the one smiling behind him. Zara Hayes learned how to disappear long before Marcus Hale taught her to be afraid. She was 14 the first time. The afternoon 2 bullets came through the front window of her mother's apartment on the south side and took the only parent she'd ever known. After that, her grandmother, Nana Ruth, pulled her into a 2-bedroom in Englewood and spent the next 12 years turning grief into structure. Wake up early, cook something, feed someone. Aunt Nana Ruth believed food was the closest thing to prayer that didn't require a church, and she raised Zara at the stove the way other women raised daughters at the piano, with repetition, discipline, and the quiet understanding that what they were building was a life raft. By 24, Zara had the dream mapped out. Her own restaurant, Southern comfort food with modern edges, a place where the plates came out warm and the door was always open. Nana Ruth had made her promise. Sitting up in the hospital bed 3 months before the cancer finished its work, oxygen tube taped to her upper lip, she'd gripped Zara's hand with a strength that had no business still existing in a body that small. "You build that kitchen, baby. You put our name on it," Zara promised. She meant it the way you mean things at deathbeds, with every cell, with no plan for what comes after. What came after was silence. The apartment without Nana Ruth's voice in it. The bills Nana Ruth's Social Security had been quietly covering. The job at the Jade Lantern that went from a stepping stone to a lifeline. Double shifts 5 days a week, her body learning the rhythms of a kitchen that wasn't hers. And then Marcus, who appeared at the bar one Thursday night, with a smile that felt like someone had finally turned the lights back on. He was charming the way fire is charming, warm at the right distance, consuming up close. The first 3 months were a highlight reel she'd replay later, trying to pinpoint when it turned. Surprise dinners, rides home after late shifts, the way he'd cup her face in both hands and tell her she was the only real thing in his life. By month 4, the questions started. Who texted you? Why are you home late? Why is your manager calling you on your day off? By month 6, the phone checks. By month 8, the first time he grabbed her arm hard enough to leave a bruise she covered with a long-sleeve shirt the next morning and explained to no one. The escalation had its own calendar. Year 1. Isolation. He cut her off from friends, not with ultimatums, but with moods. Going out meant a fight. A phone call to her cousin meant a sulk that lasted 3 days. By the time she noticed the walls closing in, they'd already sealed. Year 2. Ownership. He tracked her location. He showed up at the Jade Lantern unannounced, watching from a booth, ordering nothing. He started using the restaurant's back rooms for meetings she wasn't supposed to ask about, and money she wasn't supposed to see. She tried to leave 6 times. 6. The first time he cried so hard she held him. The second, he punched the wall beside her head, and she understood the wall was a warning. The third, fourth, and fifth collapsed under the weight of threats she believed and promises she wanted to. The 6th time, she waited until he was in Indiana for a deal, changed every lock, blocked his number, and sat on her kitchen floor with her back against the new deadbolt, shaking until sunrise. 2 days of silence. She almost believed it. Then the messages started arriving from numbers she didn't recognize, each one his voice pressed into text. You think you can just walk away from me? Soo-Yun, the hostess, was the first to ask about the bruise on Zara's wrist. Zara said she'd caught it on the walk-in door. Derek, the sous chef, asked why she flinched every time the back entrance opened. Zara said she was tired. They didn't push. People rarely do. It's easier to believe the lie than to carry the weight of the truth someone is handing you. Zara carried it alone, the way she carried everything, silently, completely, with the poisoned conviction that endurance was the same thing as strength, that if she could just survive long enough, surviving would eventually turn into living. It hadn't yet. The camera in the back storage room had been broken for 3 months. Zara knew this because she'd filed the maintenance request herself, twice, and both times it had disappeared into whatever administrative void swallowed things that weren't urgent enough for management to care about. And so when she ducked into the storage room on a Tuesday afternoon to grab a case of soju and noticed the small red light blinking above the doorframe, she almost ignored it, almost kept walking, almost let the next 3 weeks of her life unspool differently. But Zara had her grandmother's habit of fixing things that weren't her responsibility, so she checked, pulled up the security console in the manager's office after closing, scrolled through the last 72 hours of footage, looking for the timestamp when the camera came back online, and found it. Not the camera's resurrection, something else entirely. The footage was timestamped 2:14 a.m., 3 nights prior. The storage room door opening from the outside. Marcus's key, the one she'd never gotten back, the one she'd forgotten he had. Marcus stepping in first, holding the door for a man Zara had never seen. White, mid-40s, heavy build, carrying a black duffel bag that he set on the wire shelving unit between the sesame oil and the rice vinegar. Marcus unzipping it, stacks of small vacuum-sealed bags inside, contents off-white and unmistakable. The other man handing Marcus an envelope, Marcus counting what was inside. A handshake. The whole exchange lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Clinical. Practiced. The kind of transaction that had happened before and was meant to happen again. Zara watched it twice. Then she closed the console, locked the office, walked to the employee bathroom, and threw up. She didn't call the police. That decision lived in her body, not her brain, a reflex wired into place the year her mother died, and the detectives who showed up at the apartment treated a bullet-riddled living room like a paperwork inconvenience. They'd taken notes. They'd offered a card. They'd never come back. Zara learned at 14 what it costs to hand your crisis to people who experience it as a task. She wasn't doing it again. Instead, she did something she thought was smarter. She called Marcus from the restaurant's landline, neutral ground, recorded line, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her, and told him the truth. The camera was fixed. The footage existed. If he set foot in the Jade Lantern again, if he contacted her, if he so much as drove past the building, that hard drive would find its way to people who would care a great deal about what was on it. Then she hung up. For 48 hours, nothing happened. No calls, no texts, no shadow in the parking lot. Zara let herself believe she'd won. That she'd finally found the one language Marcus understood, consequence, and spoken it fluently enough to make him listen. She was thinking like a person who solves problems. Marcus was thinking like a person who eliminates them. For 3 weeks he watched, mapped her schedule, confirmed who closed on which nights, confirmed when the building emptied, confirmed that on Wednesdays Zara locked up alone, and the alley behind the restaurant went dark by midnight. He didn't plan to get the hard drive and leave her standing. He couldn't afford to. A woman with leverage is a woman with power. And Marcus had learned one thing in his years on the streets with absolute clarity. You don't negotiate with power you can't control. You remove it. The Wednesday he chose was the coldest night in January. He parked 3 blocks south, walked through the alley with the Glock in his waistband, and the certainty of a man who had already rehearsed every step. The loading dock door was unlocked. It always was during closing, propped open for the recycling run Zara did last. He could hear the water running inside. He could see the light from the kitchen cutting a rectangle across the wet concrete. He chambered around before he crossed the threshold. Zara heard the click, and the 48 hours of silence she'd mistaken for surrender revealed themselves for what they'd always been. Not retreat, but reconnaissance. Kwong Ye-jun had killed his first man at 23 and smiled through the entire thing. Not because he enjoyed it, though the men who told the story later would swear he did, but because his father had taught him that the face you show the world is the only armor that never rusts. Smile when you negotiate. Smile when you refuse. Smile when you pull the thread that unravels a man's entire life, because a smile is the one expression no one can read in reverse. By the time they understand what it means, the work is already done. He was 38 now, and the smile had become architecture. It was the first thing associates mentioned, and the last thing rivals remembered. In Seoul's import corridors, they called him Usanan Horangi, the Smiling Tiger, a name Ye-jun neither confirmed nor corrected, because names given by fear require no maintenance. His syndicate controlled a web of legitimate businesses across Chicago's North Side: import firms, dry cleaners, commercial real estate, a small fleet of refrigerated trucks that moved product both legal and otherwise through the Midwest with the quiet efficiency of weather. Every operation was layered, insulated, meticulous. Ye-jun didn't run an empire. He cultivated an ecosystem, one in which violence was a last resort not out of mercy, but because violence was expensive and patience was free. The Jade Lantern was different. The Jade Lantern was real. He'd built it 4 years ago from a gutted warehouse in Wicker Park, hired a head chef from Jeonju, sourced banchan ingredients from a grandmother in Pilsen who reminded him of his own mother, and refused to let a single dollar of syndicate money touch the operating budget after the initial build-out. The restaurant turned a profit within 18 months. The reviews were genuine. The regulars were loyal. Yejun visited twice a week, sat at the same corner booth, ordered the galbi jim, and read shipping manifests on his tablet, while the dining room hummed around him. It was the one thing he owned that owed nothing to the underworld, and he protected it with the particular ferocity men reserve for the version of themselves they wish were the whole truth. So when his lieutenant, Park Min-seo, informed him 5 months ago that a low-level dealer named Marcus Hale had been using the Jade Lantern's back storage room for exchanges, Yejun did not react with anger. Anger was a young man's currency. He reacted with attention, and he pulled the thread slowly. Who Marcus was, who supplied him, who he owed, what territories he'd been nibbling at like a rat in the walls of someone else's house. The picture assembled itself over weeks. A small, reckless, self-important man operating far beyond his depth, leveraging a relationship with one of Yejun's own waitresses to access the building. A man too insignificant to warrant violence and too careless to be left alone. Yejun filed Marcus Hale under future maintenance and moved on to things that mattered. Tonight, the filing cabinet opened itself. He'd arrived at the Jade Lantern just before midnight for a meeting Min-seo had pushed forward by 2 hours, a shipment rerouting that required a signature and a conversation best not held over the phone. He parked his black sedan at the front, entered through the main dining room with his overcoat folded over one arm, and was reaching for the light switch in the private booth when he heard it. A man's voice from the kitchen, loud, cracked with the particular pitch of someone who had lost control of a situation and was compensating with volume. And beneath it, nothing. A silence Yejun recognized immediately, because he had spent a lifetime studying the sounds people made under duress, and the most dangerous sound was always the absence of one. He walked to the kitchen door, opened it 2 inches, looked through. Marcus Hale, the rat in the walls, holding a gun to the temple of Zara Hayes. The waitress who worked doubles, the one who remembered every regular's name and never called in sick. Blood at her hairline, tears on her face, hands flat on the counter behind her. Not screaming, not begging, not bargaining, just enduring, the way people endure things they've endured before. Yejun's smile did not change. His posture did not shift. His breathing remained exactly as it had been when he walked through the front door 30 seconds ago. But something behind the expression recalibrated, a gear catching, a mechanism engaging. The quiet internal transition from a man observing a problem to a man who has decided, with absolute finality, how the problem ends. He pushed the door open, stepped into the light, snow still on his shoulders, hands at his sides, and waited, with the patience of a man who had never once needed to rush, for Marcus Hale to discover exactly how small he was. Marcus Hale. 2 words, spoken the way a doctor reads a diagnosis, flat, precise. It already passed the point of negotiation. Yejun's voice carried no threat because it didn't need to. The threat was in the information, in the fact that this man in the tailored suit and snow-dusted shoulders knew his full name, spoke it without hesitation, and hadn't raised his hands. Marcus spun. The Glock swung wide, jerking from Zara's temple toward the figure standing 10 feet behind him, then back, then splitting the difference. The barrel trembling in the no-man's land between 2 targets and hitting neither. His eyes were wild, scanning Yejun the way a cornered dog scans a room for exits. He found none. Yejun was standing between him and the kitchen door. The loading dock was behind Zara. The math was bad and getting worse. "Who the hell are you?" Marcus's voice had changed. The authority he'd wielded over Zara, that low, eye-controlling register, had cracked into something higher, thinner. The sound of a man encountering a variable he hadn't planned for. Yejun didn't answer the question. He never answered questions that surrendered positioning. Instead, he took one step forward, unhurried, deliberate, the way you'd approach a table to pour tea, and began talking as though they were resuming a conversation Marcus hadn't realized they'd already been having. "You've been using my storage room for 5 months. The exchange on November 14th, the man with the duffel bag, that was Danny Kowalski, who works for the Galecki crew on the west side. You shorted him $1,100 on that delivery. He noticed. He hasn't said anything yet because he thinks you're connected to someone who matters." Ye-jun paused. The smile widened by a fraction. "You're not." Marcus's arm was fully extended now, the Glock aimed at Ye-jun's chest, but the tremor running from his wrist to his elbow was visible under the fluorescent light. Sweat had broken across his forehead, despite the cold still flooding through the loading dock. Ye-jun continued the way a man turns pages. "You owe Ray Nguyen's people $43,000 in product. You moved and didn't pay for. You've been cutting your supply with baking soda since September, which your buyers haven't caught yet, but your suppliers have. You drive a black Dodge Charger registered to your brother's girlfriend. You keep a Ruger in the center console and $11,000 in a shoebox under your bathroom sink." He let each fact land like a card dealt face up. "I know where you sleep, Marcus. I know where your brother sleeps. I've known for 5 months. If I wanted you gone, you would never have made it to this kitchen." The gun lowered. Not all the way. Marcus's pride wouldn't allow that. But enough. The barrel dipped toward the floor, his arm finally surrendering to the weight his certainty could no longer carry. His jaw worked, chewing on a response that wouldn't come. Ye-jun gave him the only mercy he intended to. "You're going to walk out that door. You're going to get in your car. You're going to drive, and you're going to wait for what comes next. That's the only offer you'll receive from me, and I won't make it twice." Marcus looked at Zara. Something moved behind his eyes. Not remorse, nothing that clean. Just the furious recalculation of a man realizing the woman he'd terrorized was no longer his to reach. Then he bolted. Shouldered past the loading dock door, boots hitting snow, and disappeared into the alley like the building had expelled him. The kitchen went quiet. The grill had stopped ticking. The snow kept falling through the open door, accumulating now in a crescent across the threshold. Somewhere outside, a car engine started, and tires bit into ice. Ye-jun stood still for 3 seconds. Then he turned to Zara. The shift was immediate, visible, physical, like watching someone remove a mask they'd forgotten they were wearing. His shoulders dropped half an inch, his chin lowered. The smile didn't disappear, but it changed, softened into something that wasn't performance, wasn't strategy, something that cost him to show. "Are you hurt?" Zara opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Her hands were still pressed flat against the counter, locked in the position Marcus had put her in, her body refusing to accept that the geometry of the room had changed. The blood from her temple had dried to a dark line running past her ear and into the collar of her red uniform. Her breath came in short, visible bursts in the cold air. Then the counter stopped holding her. Her knees buckled. She slid down the steel surface and hit the floor, and the sound that came out of her was not a scream or a cry, but something older. A breaking open, tectonic. The release of pressure that had been building for 2 years and 26 minutes, and her entire life before that. Ye-jun didn't move toward her, didn't crouch, didn't touch. He stood exactly where he was and let her break apart on her own terms, so because he understood, perhaps better than anyone in her life ever had, that the most violent thing you can do to someone who has just survived is to reach for them before they're ready. The night had just begun, but for the first time in it, Zara Hayes was not alone. Ye-jun made 3 phone calls before Zara's breathing had fully steadied. The first was to Park Min-seo, who answered on a single ring, the way he always did, when the caller was the only person whose calls he never let go to voicemail. The instruction was brief. Full surveillance on Marcus Hale, effective immediately. Every associate, every safe house, every phone number, every dollar in and out. The second call was to a private security firm on retainer that operated without business cards. Two men would be stationed in a vehicle outside Zara's apartment building within the hour, rotating in 12-hour shifts, reporting directly to Minseo. The third was to a woman named Cho Hai-wan, who managed Yejun's financial intelligence operations and had a talent for making money disappear from people who didn't yet know they'd lost it. Hai-wan's assignment: map Marcus Hale's entire supply chain and begin cutting arteries. By sunrise, the machine was running. Within 48 hours, Hai-wan had traced every supplier Marcus depended on: 3 mid-level distributors connected to the Galecki crew, a courier service operating out of a barbershop in Humboldt Park, and a moneyman in Cicero who laundered Marcus's earnings through a used car lot. Yejun didn't raid them, didn't threaten them. He simply made sure each one received, through channels that couldn't be traced back to him, an accurate accounting of how much Marcus owed them and how long he'd been shorting their product. The math did the rest. Within a week, Marcus's phone calls stopped being returned. His suppliers froze his credit. The courier service changed its locks. The moneyman in Cicero sent word through intermediaries that Marcus Hale was no longer a name he wished to hear spoken in his establishment. Marcus didn't know who was pulling the threads. He only knew the threads were pulling, and because Marcus Hale was exactly the kind of man who responds to losing control in one arena by seizing it in another, he turned the only direction he still could: toward Zara. The tires came first. All 4 slashed in the lot behind her apartment building on a Tuesday night. The cuts clean and deliberate. A signature more than a sabotage. Then the texts. New burner numbers every few days. Messages that read like ransom notes, stripped of demands. I know where you are. I know when you sleep. You did this. Then he started showing up. Not approaching. Just appearing. Across the street from her building, leaning against a parked car. In the grocery store lot when she came out with bags. At the bus stop, she used when the slashed tires made driving impossible. Never close enough to arrest. Always close enough to suffocate. Zara's world shrank the way it had before. The same collapsing geometry, the same shrinking rooms, the same sensation of air being rationed. Except now the architecture of fear had a gun in its foundation. She stopped leaving her apartment after dark, stopped answering numbers she didn't recognize, and stopped sleeping in her bedroom because the window faced the street, and started sleeping in the bathroom with the door locked and the light on, her back against the tub like a woman sheltering from a storm that had no season. She was packing a bag on a Thursday morning, bus ticket to Detroit, where a cousin she hadn't spoken to in 3 years might still live, when her phone rang. A number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. Something made her. "You don't have to run." Yejun's voice, unmistakable. That calm, unhurried cadence that sounded like a man with nowhere to be because he'd already been everywhere that mattered. He's being handled. It will take time. But the outcome is not in question. You don't have to leave your home. Zara stood in her hallway, one hand on the half-packed duffel, on the other pressing the phone against her ear hard enough to feel the screen flex. "Why should I believe you?" "Because if I intended to let him reach you, I wouldn't have called." Silence, the kind that carries weight. Zara set the duffel bag on the floor. She didn't unpack it, not yet, but she set it down. And for the first time since the night in the kitchen, she felt something she barely recognized and didn't yet trust. The specific, unfamiliar sensation of someone with real power choosing to point it in her direction, not to control her, but to hold the line while she decided what came next. She sat on her hallway floor, back against the wall, and waited. Not for rescue. not for permission, just for the ground beneath her to stop shaking long enough to stand. A cornered animal doesn't calculate. It charges the nearest wall and calls it a door. Marcus Hale had been cornered for 11 days. His suppliers had gone silent. His courier had vanished. The money man in Cicero had returned his last envelope unopened with a single sentence relayed through a third party. "We don't know you." 11 days of calls that rang into nothing, of texts that delivered but never drew replies, of showing up to meeting points and finding them empty. Not cleared out, just empty, as though the infrastructure of his life had been quietly disassembled while he slept and replaced with air. He'd stopped eating regularly, stopped sleeping in the same place twice. He moved between his brother's couch, a motel in Berwyn, and the backseat of the Charger, at cycling locations, with the frantic logic of a man who understood he was being watched but couldn't identify from where. The paranoia had a taste now, metallic, constant, like blood pooling under the tongue. On the 12th day, he bought a second gun, a snub-nosed .38 from a contact in Englewood, who still answered his calls, though reluctantly, and only in person. Marcus shoved it into his jacket pocket alongside the Glock he hadn't let go of since the night in the kitchen. 2 weapons, 1 plan. Finish what he started. The witness first, then the hard drive, then gone. South, maybe, or east, wherever the name Marcus Hale hadn't yet been made synonymous with liability. He watched Zara's apartment for 2 days from a parking garage across the street. He mapped her movements, the morning walk to the corner store, the Thursday evening therapy appointment she'd started keeping, the way she paused at her building's front door every night and scanned the street before entering, the way her eyes always moved, left first. He chose his window. Friday, 11:47 p.m., when she'd returned from a late shift at a friend's restaurant where she'd been picking up hours. The street would be quiet. The entrance would be lit, but unmonitored. 30 seconds of exposure between her car and the door. Enough. What Marcus did not map, because he couldn't, because the architecture was invisible, were the 2 men in the gray sedan who had been parked on his perimeter for 13 days. Or the second vehicle staged on the adjacent block. Or the third man on foot, rotating positions every 4 hours, feeding real-time location data to Park Min Seo's phone. So Yejun had not anticipated Marcus's timeline. He had done something more efficient. He had made the timeline irrelevant. It didn't matter when Marcus moved. It mattered that every possible move had already been accounted for. Friday, 11:43 p.m. Zara's car pulled onto her street. Marcus stepped out of the parking garage stairwell, right hand inside his jacket. He crossed the street in the space between 2 streetlights, moving fast, breath steaming, boots hitting pavement with the rhythm of a man past the point of hesitation. He made it 14 steps. The gray sedan's doors opened simultaneously. 2 men, compact, efficient, faces Marcus would never be able to describe in any useful detail, closed the distance from opposite angles. Marcus reached for the Glock. A hand caught his wrist before the barrel cleared his waistband. The second man took his knees from behind. Marcus hit the sidewalk face first, the impact splitting his lip against the frozen concrete. The .38 was extracted from his jacket pocket, with the clinical indifference of a surgeon removing something that didn't belong. By the time Marcus rolled onto his back, blood in his teeth and snow melting against his scalp, Jong Yejun was standing above him, overcoat, dark suit, hands in his pockets. That smile. Yejun crouched slowly, bringing himself to Marcus's eye level, the way a parent lowers to a child who has broken something irreplaceable. His knees didn't touch the snow. His coat didn't wrinkle. Even gravity seemed to negotiate with this man. "I told you to wait for what comes next." Yejun's voice was conversational, almost warm, the tone of someone delivering information that was no longer optional. This is what comes next. Your complete transaction history has been sent to the Chicago Police Department's Narcotics Division, anonymously, thoroughly, with timestamps. A separate package has been delivered to Danny Kowalski and Ray Nguyen's people, documenting every dollar you shorted them. Both packages arrived tonight. There is no version of the next 48 hours in which you are a free man, Marcus. The only question is, who finds you first? Marcus's mouth opened. Nothing useful came out. Yejun stood, straightened his coat, nodded once to his men, a gesture so small it barely registered as movement, carrying the weight of a verdict that had been written weeks ago and was only now being read aloud. They lifted Marcus off the ground and put him into the gray sedan with the efficiency of men who had done this before and would sleep soundly after doing it again. The doors closed. The car pulled away from the curb without urgency, taillights shrinking into the dark, carrying Marcus Hale toward the accumulated weight of every debt he'd pretended didn't exist. Zara was standing at her building's entrance, keys in her hand, frozen in the posture of a woman who had watched the last 2 minutes unfold from 30 feet away and was still processing whether any of it had been real. The street was quiet again. Snow fell through the cone of the streetlight above her in slow, diagonal lines. Yejun walked toward her, stopped at a distance that was deliberate, close enough to be heard, far enough to not be looming. He reached into his coat and produced a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside it, the Glock, the one from the kitchen, the one whose muzzle Zara still felt against her temple when she closed her eyes. "This will be included in the file sent to the police," he said. "It won't touch you. None of this will." Zara looked at the bag, at the gun sealed inside it like a specimen, at the man holding it, whose face carried that unreadable smile, though something behind his eyes, something she couldn't name and he would never admit to, looked almost tired. She didn't thank him. She wasn't ready for that, and he didn't seem to expect it. She unlocked her door, stepped inside, and closed it behind her. The deadbolt turned. A sound Yejun heard clearly in the winter silence, a small, definitive click that meant exactly one thing. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer, snow accumulating on his shoulders, watching the light in her apartment come on. Then he turned, walked to his car, and drove into the city he owned pieces of, but could never fully control. Behind him, the snow began covering the place where Marcus Hale had fallen. Slowly, softly, the way it covers everything in Chicago, without judgment, without memory, until the ground looks like nothing ever happened there at all. The gun was gone, but the barrel stayed. Zara felt it in the shower when the pipes knocked, a cold circle pressing into her temple, phantom and precise, her body dropping into a crouch before her brain could override the signal. She felt it in the grocery store when a man behind her dropped a jar of pasta sauce and the glass hit the linoleum like a gunshot. And she was on the floor between the shelves with her hands over her head before she understood she was in aisle 9 and not a stainless steel kitchen. She felt it at 3 in the morning, lying rigid on her bathroom floor with every light in the apartment blazing, unable to close her eyes because the darkness behind her lids was always the same darkness. Fluorescent buzz, cold air through the loading dock, the smell of sesame and gun oil, and Marcus's breath against her ear, saying words she couldn't unhear, no matter how many hours she put between herself and that night. She couldn't go back to the Jade Lantern. She tried once, made it to the front door, saw the hostess stand through the glass, and her vision narrowed to a tunnel. Her hands went numb, her chest locked. She sat on the sidewalk outside the restaurant for 20 minutes, on breathing into her palms, while pedestrians stepped around her like she was weather. The therapist appeared the way everything from Yejun appeared, without fanfare, without conditions, without a visible thread connecting the gift to the giver. A business card slipped under her apartment door. Dr. Vanessa Liu, trauma specialist, with a handwritten note on the back that said only, Tuesdays and Thursdays, whenever you're ready. Already covered. Zara held the card for 2 days before she called. She went on a Thursday. She sat in a chair across from a woman with patient eyes and said nothing for the first 30 minutes. Dr. Liu let her. On the second visit, Zara said 11 words. A man put a gun to my head, and I survived. On the third visit, she said more. The dam didn't break all at once. It leaked, slowly, in the particular way trauma exits the body when the body finally believes it's allowed to let go. Ye-jun kept his distance. The financial support arrived in the form of an envelope left with her building's concierge, enough to cover 2 months of rent and the shifts she'd missed. No note, no return address. He did not call, did not visit, did not insert himself into the narrative of her recovery as though he'd earned a role in it. But Zara needed one conversation. Just one. She called the number he'd used the night he told her not to run. He answered on the second ring. She asked him to meet her. He suggested the restaurant. She said, no. They met at a diner in Logan Square on a Wednesday afternoon. Neutral ground. Public space. A booth by the window where Zara could see the door and both exits. She noticed Ye-jun clock this when he sat down. He said nothing about it. She ordered coffee she didn't drink. He ordered nothing. Why do you care what happens to me? Ye-jun's hands were folded on the table. His expression held its usual architecture. The smile, the calm, the curated stillness of a man who had long ago decided which parts of himself the world was permitted to see. He answered without hesitation. Because you were hurt in my house, on my watch, that makes it my debt. It was a clean answer, a structured answer, the kind of answer a man gives when he spent his life converting emotion into obligation, because obligation is easier to manage. Zara set her coffee down. I'm not your debt. Her voice didn't waver. It had the quality of something that had been rehearsed, not for performance, but for survival. The way you rehearse the truest things because they're the hardest to say out loud. I'm not anyone's debt. I'm not anyone's project. I'm not a loose end. You need to tie off so you can sleep at night. Ye-jun didn't respond immediately. His fingers unfolded, refolded. Emotion so small, it would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't watching for it. But Zara had spent 2 years learning to read the micro-movements of dangerous men, and she saw it. The fracture. The moment the structure shifted, the smile faded. Not dramatically, not a collapse, not a revelation. It simply left, the way warmth leaves a room when someone opens a window. What remained was a face Zara suspected very few people had ever been permitted to see. Tired, human, uncertain in a way that looked almost painful on features built for control. No, he said quietly. You're not. He reached for nothing. Offered nothing. Didn't fill the silence with reassurance or explanation or the particular brand of generosity that is really just ownership with a longer leash. He sat across from her in a diner booth in Logan Square and gave her the thing no man in her life had ever given her. Not protection, not provision, not rescue. Space. The complete, unqualified absence of expectation. The freedom to define her own terms without a man's framework wrapped around the definition. Zara nodded. Once. Then she stood, left money on the table for the coffee she hadn't touched, and walked out into the afternoon. Ye-jun remained in the booth for a long time after she left. His reflection in the window stared back at him, a man who controlled shipping routes and supply chains and the fates of men who crossed him, and sitting alone with an untouched glass of water and the unfamiliar ache of having let something go that he hadn't realized he was holding. He put his coat on, left the diner, didn't look back. The smile returned by the time he reached his car, but it fit differently now, like a suit taken in slightly, still functional, still precise, but altered in a way only the wearer would notice. Healing didn't arrive. It accumulated, in thin, uneven layers, like paint applied by hand, each coat covering something but never quite erasing it. Zara went to therapy on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Some sessions she talked for the full hour. Some sessions, she sat with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea Dr. Liu kept filled without asking, and the silence did its own work. She learned words for things she'd been carrying unnamed: hypervigilance, trauma bonding, the fawn response. She learned that the instinct to endure everything wasn't strength. It was a survival mechanism that had saved her life and was now slowly suffocating it. She learned that healing wasn't the absence of damage, but the decision to stop building around it and start building through. She started cooking again in March, not professionally, just for herself, alone in her apartment on Sunday mornings, with the windows open and Nana Ruth's cast-iron skillet heating on the stove, collard greens braised low and slow with smoked turkey necks, buttermilk cornbread with honey and cracked black pepper, sweet potato pie with a bourbon glaze Nana Ruth would have side-eyed, but secretly loved. The recipes came back like muscle memory, her hands knowing the measurements before her mind caught up, her grandmother's voice narrating from somewhere inside her chest. She cooked and she ate standing at the counter, and she cried sometimes, and she didn't apologize for any of it. By April, she was calling people back. Keisha, her cousin in Detroit, who picked up on the first ring and said, "Girl, where have you been?" with a voice that held no accusation, only relief. Tanya and Maris, friends from before Marcus, who came over with wine and sat on Zara's living room floor and didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. The circle rebuilt itself slowly, not to what it had been, but to something sturdier, the way a bone heals thicker at the break. The lease appeared in May, a small storefront in Pilsen, corner lot, south-facing windows, a kitchen that needed work but had bones, good ventilation, a gas line already roughed in, and enough square footage for 30 covers and a 4-top bar. The broker mentioned the landlord had been flexible on terms in a way that seemed unusual for the neighborhood. Zara didn't ask why. She suspected. She chose not to confirm, because confirming would mean the gift required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement could become a thread someone else held. She signed the lease with her own name and began renovations the following week. Nana's table opened on a Wednesday in July. 28 seats, a handwritten menu. Nana Ruth's cast-iron skillet mounted on the wall behind the pass like a coat of arms. Zara stood in her kitchen at 5 o'clock, chef's coat pressed, braids pulled back, hand steady, and opened the doors to a dining room that filled within the hour and didn't empty until 10. So the first review appeared in a neighborhood food blog 3 days later. The writer called it "food that feels like someone is holding your hand." Zara read the line twice, set her phone down, and prepped for Saturday brunch. Marcus Hale's death appeared in the news on a Tuesday in September. A single paragraph in the Tribune's crime blotter. An inmate killed at a county holding facility. The assailants connected to a West Side distribution network he'd owed money to. The article didn't mention Zara. It didn't mention the jade lantern or a gun or a kitchen or snow. It reduced Marcus to a paragraph the way the world reduces men who burn through every second chance, quickly, without ceremony, into a space the size of a footnote. Zara read the article once, sitting in Nana's table's kitchen before the lunch rush, and she read it the way you read weather reports for cities you no longer live in, with recognition, but not residence. She closed her phone, tied her apron, checked the stock on the collard greens, and adjusted the seasoning on the sweet potato soup. She felt nothing she needed to apologize for. Grief is not mandatory for the death of the person who almost killed you, Relief is not a sin. And the absence of feeling is sometimes the most honest feeling there is. The body's quiet acknowledgement that a door has closed on a room it no longer needs to enter. She prepped for the dinner rush. The kitchen hummed. The skillet on the wall caught the light. Nana Ruth's granddaughter was exactly where she'd promised to be. The waiting list was 42 names long by 6 o'clock, and Zara stood at the pass in Nana's table's new kitchen, twice the size of the original copper pots hanging from a ceiling rack she'd installed herself, an 8-burner range that hummed like something alive, and watched through the window as the dining room filled. 64 seats now, up from 28. Exposed brick walls, warm pendant lights casting amber pools over white tablecloths. A hand-lettered sign above the entrance that read, "Nana's Table" in script Zara had traced from her grandmother's handwriting, pulled from a recipe card for peach cobbler that she'd kept in a shoebox for 11 years. Opening night of the expansion, and every seat was spoken for. Her chef's coat was pressed, her braids were pulled back. Nana Ruth's cast-iron skillet hung on the wall behind her, not stored, not shelved, mounted, on the way you mount something you've earned the right to display. The kitchen moved around her in the organized chaos she'd spent a year learning to conduct. Tickets firing, pans hissing, her sous chef calling out times, the controlled urgency of a room where every person knows their role and trusts the person beside them to know theirs. At 7:15, her host, a young woman named Deja, who reminded Zara of herself at 22, appeared at the kitchen window with an arrangement of white peonies in a glass vase. Someone left these at the stand. No card. Same as every Monday. Zara looked at the flowers. 6 months of Mondays. Never a card. Never a signature. Never a follow-up call or an appearance at the door or any gesture that demanded recognition in return. Just peonies, white and full, so arriving like clockwork, from a man who understood that the purest form of care is the kind that asks for nothing, not even to be acknowledged. She smiled, set the flowers on the shelf above the expediting station, went back to the line. The dinner rush lasted until 10:30. The last table lingered over bourbon pecan pie and coffee. Zara shook hands, accepted compliments, watched her dining room empty with the quiet satisfaction of a woman standing inside a promise she'd kept. By 11, the staff had gone. By 11:30, Zara was alone, wiping counters, wrapping prep, moving through the closing routine that had become her favorite hour of the day. The restaurant after hours, hers in the silence. She was returning the peonies to the host stand when she felt the envelope. Small, cream-colored, or tucked between the stems where it wouldn't be found by anyone who wasn't looking. She opened it standing under the entrance light. Inside, a photograph. Black and white, slightly grainy, pulled from a security camera's footage. The kitchen of the Jade Lantern, time-stamped the night everything changed. In the foreground, blurred and partial, a man's arm, the outline of a gun. In the background, stepping through the kitchen doorway with snow on his shoulders and his hands at his sides, Jeong Yejun. The overcoat, the posture. That unmistakable smile, caught mid-arrival, frozen in the half-second before the room's geometry shifted forever. Zara turned the photograph over, handwritten on the back in precise, unhurried script. Some people wait to be rescued. Others survive long enough to rescue themselves. You were always the second kind. IJ, she stood in the doorway of her restaurant for a long time, holding the photograph, breathing the November air that carried the first bite of winter. She thought about the kitchen, the gun, the cold flooding through the loading dock. She thought about Marcus's voice and the taste of her own pulse, and the man who stepped into the light when every other light was going out. She thought about the diner in Logan Square, the smile leaving his face, the word "no" spoken quietly across a table. She thought about what it costs to be seen by someone who could own you and chooses not to. She carried the photograph back into the kitchen and pinned it to the wall above her prep station, next to Nana Ruth's recipe card and a photograph of her mother laughing on a porch that no longer existed. Not a memorial to the worst night of her life. Not a shrine. Proof. Evidence that she had walked into the darkest room she'd ever entered and built a door on the other side with her own hands. Zara locked the front door, turned off the pendant lights one by one, set the alarm, stepped outside. Chicago spread before her, the same city that had taken her mother, raised her grandmother, caged her in a man's obsession, and handed her, eventually, the raw materials to build a life worth defending. The streets were lit. The air was cold. Her breath fogged in front of her and dissolved, the way all temporary things dissolve, leaving only what's solid behind. She walked home. Not quickly, not cautiously, not scanning the street the way she used to. Left first, always. Left first, always looking for the shape of a man in the shadows. She walked the way a woman walks when the ground beneath her belongs to her again. Steady, unhurried, present in her own body, in her own name, in the quiet, ferocious fact of her continued existence. Zara Hayes. No one's victim, no one's asset, no one's collateral, no one's debt. Just a woman who learned that the most dangerous thing she could do, more dangerous than a gun, more dangerous than a smile, more dangerous than any empire built on silence, was refuse to disappear. And somewhere across the city, in a high-rise overlooking the black mirror of Lake Michigan, Jung Ye-jun sat in the dark with a glass of something he wasn't drinking, watching the skyline and thinking about a woman he would never visit, a restaurant he would never enter, and the strange, irreversible weight of having cared about something he chose to set free. The tiger watches, not because he doesn't care, but because some things are too important to cage. The flowers would arrive again on Monday. Some men carry guns, some carry smiles, but the ones who survive carry something heavier, the knowledge that they were worth saving all along.